For 30 years, the tank was supposed to be dead. After the Cold War ended, the great armored divisions of Europe were broken up. Fleets that had once numbered in the thousands were cut to the hundreds, then to the dozens. Politicians spoke of a peace dividend. Generals were told to plan for small wars in distant places. The age of the heavy land force, they said, was finally over. Then, in February of 2022, a long column of Russian tanks rolled across the border into Ukraine. 3 years and 4,000 verified destroyed Russian tanks later, the picture has been turned upside down. Turkey still leads Europe on raw numbers, with around 2,381 main battle tanks. Greece sits in second with 1,385, but the country quietly building the most dangerous armored force on the continent is not either of them. It is Poland, currently fielding around 897 tanks, with plans to push that to 1,800 or 1,900, almost all of them brand new. By the time it is finished, Europe will have an armored spine running from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathians that looks nothing like the polite downsized force structure of just 5 years ago. This is the story of how the tank came back, how a weapon that had been written off as a relic returned to the center of European defense policy. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which countries lead Europe's new armored order, which tanks define the modern battlefield, and why a vehicle built by a country most viewers would not even put on the list, South Korea, is now widely considered the most expensive and possibly the most lethal main battle tank ever produced. This is the European tank race, and it is going to decide what kind of continent the next generation lives on. To understand what is happening now, you have to understand the world that came before it, because the European tank picture of 2026 is, in many ways, an inversion of the European tank picture of 1985, and the journey between those 2 points is the entire story. In the middle of the 1980s, NATO and the Warsaw Pact stared at each other across a line that ran from the Baltic Sea to the Alps. The Soviet Union and its satellites fielded somewhere in the region of 50,000 main battle tanks in Europe alone. NATO matched them with around 23,000 of its own. The expected battlefield ran through the rolling hills of central Germany, around a stretch of countryside known as the Fulda Gap. Every NATO country tailored its forces to that mission. West Germany alone fielded more than 4,000 Leopards. The British Army of the Rhine kept hundreds of chieftains and challengers forward deployed. The Americans had 2 corps in Europe with thousands of Abrams. Even Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark all fielded their own heavy armor. The continent bristled with steel. Then, almost without warning, the threat dissolved. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. The Warsaw Pact collapsed in 1991. The Soviet Union followed before Christmas of that same year. Suddenly, 23,000 NATO tanks were pointed at empty ground. What followed was one of the largest military drawdowns in modern history. Across the 1990s and into the 2000s, European armies cut their tank fleets again and again. Politicians wanted dividends. Defense ministries wanted to fund expeditionary operations in the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan, where heavy armor was less useful than helicopters, light infantry, and special forces. The numbers tell the story. Germany, which had over 4,000 tanks at the end of the Cold War, today fields just 313 Leopard 2s in service, about 90% fewer than it operated at peak. The Netherlands sold off its entire tank force outright. Today, the Dutch contribute crews to a joint German-Dutch Leopard battalion rather than running their own. Belgium did the same and disbanded its tank arm completely. Denmark cut its fleet to a token reserve and now operates just 44 Leopard 2 A7V hulls. Britain reduced its Challenger fleet to 213 Challenger 2s and is converting only 148 of those to the next standard. France allowed its Leclerc fleet to dwindle to 200 hulls, and only 51 have so far been brought up to the modern XLR configuration. This was not just a numbers problem, it was a doctrine problem. A whole generation of officers had been trained to fight insurgencies and stabilization campaigns. The skills required to maneuver an armored division, coordinating fuel, ammunition, engineering vehicles, electronic warfare, drones, and reconnaissance, those skills atrophied. Tank gunnery competitions, once a serious matter of national pride, became polite affairs with too few entrants. Live fire exercises at brigade level became rare events. The continent had not just shrunk its armor, it had partially forgotten how to use it. In the meantime, Russia did not forget. Through the 2000s and the 2010s, Russia kept pouring resources into modernizing its tank fleet. New variants of the T-72 and T-80 appeared. the advanced T-90M ProRiv entered service, and in 2015, Russia unveiled the T-14 Armata, a futuristic unmanned turret design that promised to eclipse anything in NATO service. Russia had clearly decided that tanks still mattered. The question was whether Europe would notice in time. In February of 2022, Europe noticed, and the entire equation changed within weeks. The first thing the Ukraine war did was kill, very publicly, the idea that the tank was obsolete. For about a month in the spring of 2022, defense commentators across the world watched videos of Russian armor being destroyed by Javelin missiles and improvised drones, and pronounced last rites over the entire concept of armored warfare. It was wrong. The first Russian advance failed not because tanks are obsolete, but because the Russian army had abandoned the rules that make tanks survivable. Unsupported columns drove down narrow roads, with no proper infantry screen, no overhead air cover, no engineer support, and broken logistics. The lesson was not that tanks are dead. The lesson was that tanks alone, used badly, will be slaughtered. By the second year of fighting, the picture had inverted. The war had become an enormous artillery and drone duel, with tanks performing exactly the role they had performed in the Second World War and the Cold War, providing protected, mobile firepower at the decisive point. Ukrainian commanders begged for more Western tanks, not fewer. The numbers from Ukraine are sobering. Open source loss tracking from the project known as Oryx has now confirmed more than 4,000 Russian tanks destroyed since February 2022, a figure higher than the entire active tank fleet of every NATO army in Europe combined, several times over. Among those losses are around 137 of Russia's most modern T-90M variants, which have been marketed as a generational leap forward. Russian autoloader carousels, which store ammunition in a ring beneath the turret, continue to produce the violent turret ejections that have become the grim signature of Russian armor losses. No amount of reactive armor compensates for an ammunition design that turns every penetration into a potential catastrophe. Western tanks have not been immune either. The Leopard 2 A6 variants supplied to Ukraine suffered notable losses to drones, anti-tank guided missiles, and minefields. Around 80 of the older M1A1 Abrams variants were also sent. Roughly 20 of those were destroyed or disabled, a loss rate that prompted Ukrainian commanders to pull the type back from the most intense sectors of the front. Crucially, those Abrams were the older variant without an active protection system. The lesson everyone took away from Ukraine was the same. Any tank operating without active protection, without anti-drone defenses, and without proper combined arms support is, in modern conditions, a target. The second great lesson was about quantity. Russia entered the war with thousands of tanks in active service and over 2,000 more in storage. It was willing to lose them at a rate that no Western army can match. NATO is now building doctrine around the assumption that if a similar war began on the eastern flank tomorrow, the alliance would run out of tanks long before the enemy did. That single realization, more than any other, drove the procurement wave that followed. Nowhere did the lessons of Ukraine land harder than in the countries closest to the fighting. And the country that responded fastest, hardest, and most ambitiously was Poland, which we will come back to in detail in just a moment, because its fleet now defines the entire shape of the European tank race. The country that perhaps changed most, in symbolic terms, was Germany. For a generation, German politicians had treated their armed forces as a low-priority irritant. The political shift announced in February 2022, what the Germans themselves called the Zeitenwende, or turning point, ended that. A special fund of 100 billion euros was set aside. Orders for new Leopard 2 A8 tanks began to flow. Germany now fields 313 Leopards in service, 104 of the latest A7V variant, and a further 209 in A, 5 and a 6 configurations. France, Italy, Spain and Britain all moved more cautiously, but in the same direction. France committed to the Leclerc XLR upgrade, and to a longer-term joint program with Germany called the Main Ground Combat System. The United Kingdom committed to converting 148 of its Challenger 2s to the new Challenger 3 standard. Italy belatedly began planning a serious replacement for its aging Ariete fleet. Spain, operating around 274 hulls, began studying a path to the new A8 standard. In Northern Europe, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway all upgraded or expanded their Leopard fleets. The Czech Republic and Slovakia began moving away from Soviet-era T-72s toward the Western standard. Hungary committed to a mixed Leopard force. Even Romania, despite still operating an unusual fleet of more than 370 older T-55s and TR-85s, began the long process of adopting modern Western platforms. Now let us walk down the list country by country and look at where each major European tank power stood by the start of 2026. At the top of the list, by raw fleet size, sits Turkey, with 2,381 tanks. But the composition of that fleet is striking. The bulk of it is older. 750 M48A 5T2s, 650 M60A 3T TS hulls, 165 upgraded M60T M-Firat variants, 100 more M60A1s, and over 400 Leopard 1s in 2 configurations. There are also 236 Leopard 2 A4s, 80 upgraded Leopard 2 A4T1s, and just 3 of the new Turkish-designed Altay tanks. So Turkey leads on numbers, but its modern share is still small. In second place comes Greece, with 1,385 tanks. Athens has long maintained one of the largest tank fleets in Europe because of its ongoing tensions with Turkey across the Aegean. Greek tank parks include 170 advanced Leopard 2 A6 HEL variants, 183 Leopard 2 A4s, and a substantial inventory of around 500 Leopard 1s still in reserve service. Combined, Greece comfortably exceeds 1,000 hulls, although readiness rates and modernization levels vary considerably across the fleet. In third comes Poland, with 897 tanks today, on track for 1,800 or 1,900. The Polish fleet itself is unprecedented in modern European history. It includes 180 K2 Black Panthers from South Korea, 117 American M1A2SEP version 3 Abrams, 116 older EM1A1s, 105 Leopard 2A5s, 92 domestically upgraded Leopard 2 PL hulls, 205 older Polish PT, 91 Twardy tanks, and 46 legacy T-72s. No other European country runs such a deliberately mixed Western armory. In fourth, surprisingly to many viewers, comes Romania, with 377 tanks, mostly older T-55s and TR-85s. Germany sits next with 313 Leopard 2s. Spain follows with 274 hulls. Finland and France come next, both with 200. The United Kingdom operates 213 Challenger 2s in transition to Challenger 3. Sweden fields 110 Stridsvagn 122s. Switzerland 134. Cyprus operates an unusual fleet of 134 hulls, 82 ex-Soviet T-80Us, and 52 French AMX-30 B2s. For global comparison, China currently fields around 4,700 main battle tanks, mixing legacy designs with newer ZTZ, 96A, and 99A models. Russia fields around 3,460 active tanks, plus more than 2,000 in storage. The United States fields around 2,640 Abrams, including 540 M1A1A versions, 1,320 M1A2S EP version 2s, and 780 M1A2S EP version 3s, with about 1,500 more in reserve. The bottom line is that when measured globally, no single European country comes close to the tank strength of China, Russia, or the United States. But European NATO members combined can now field a heavily modernized armored force that, for the first time since the late 1990s, has serious mass and serious quality at the same time. A list of fleet sizes is only half the story. The other half is the actual machines. Here, in the consensus rankings of 2026 built around real combat data from Ukraine and Gaza, are the 10 main battle tanks defining the modern battlefield. In 10th place, the Chinese Type 99A. A weight of around 55 to 58 tons, a 125mm smoothbore that can fire gun-launched anti-tank missiles, an autoloader, and what Chinese sources describe as a laser-based countermeasure system. The Type 99A is technologically ambitious, but it has never seen combat, has never been exported, and its armor composition remains classified. Until it is tested under fire or evaluated by an outside party, its real capabilities remain an unknown. In 9th place, the British Challenger 3. This is one of the most significant transformations of any Western tank in the modern era. The Challenger 2 had reached the end of its development potential, and the upgrade is in many respects a brand new tank. The most important change is the gun. For decades, the Challenger had retained a rifled main gun, which limited its compatibility with NATO ammunition. The Challenger 3 replaces it with a Rheinmetall L55A 120mm smoothbore, allowing British tanks to use the full range of standard NATO rounds for the first time. New armor modules, an upgraded turret, modern sensors, and an active protection system complete the package. The reason it ranks 9th, not higher, is sheer scale. Only 148 conversions, a Cold War-era engine, and a fleet smaller than that of any other major NATO power. In 8th place, the Russian T-14 Armata. Conceptually revolutionary, an entirely unmanned turret, a 3-person crew sealed in an armored capsule in the hull. An active protection system designed to intercept incoming projectiles. On paper, a generation ahead. In practice, after a decade of promises, total Russian production is believed to be fewer than 24 hulls. There is no verified evidence of the Armata being deployed in any meaningful role in Ukraine. The gap between ambition and industrial reality is the defining story of this program. In 7th place, the Turkish Altay. A credible modern tank in the 65-ton class, mounting a license-produced Rheinmetall 120mm L55 smoothbore, fitted with thermal imaging and a hunter-killer fire control system. Designed and integrated by Turkish industry, currently powered by South Korean Doosan engines, while a domestic Turkish power pack is finalized. Serial production began in late 2023, and only a handful are in service so far. Promising, but unproven. In 6th place, the Japanese Type 10. The lightest modern main battle tank in production, at around 44 tons, designed to operate across Japan's mountainous, infrastructure-constrained islands. A 120mm smoothbore, an autoloader, modular composite armor incorporating nanocrystal steel, and a digital networking suite from the ground up. It cannot match heavier tanks for passive protection, but it is arguably the best tool for its specific job, defending the Japanese home islands. In 5th place, the Israeli Merkava Mark V Barak. The Merkava is unlike any other tank on this list. Its front-mounted engine, dating back to the original Mark I in 1979, places the power pack between the crew and incoming fire, providing an additional layer of protection. A rear door allows the tank to carry infantry or evacuate wounded. The Mark V integrates the Israeli Trophy Active Protection System as standard, an artificial intelligence-driven battle management system, and a helmet-mounted display called Iron Vision that gives the crew a 360-degree augmented reality view from inside a closed hull. Trophy has intercepted hundreds of anti-tank threats in Gaza with a success rate above 90%. The Merkava family is the most combat-tested current production tank in the world. In 4th place, the South Korean K2 Black Panther. We will return to this tank in a moment because it deserves its own deep section, but here is the short version. A weight of around 55 tons, a 120mm L55 smoothbore, an autoloader, an indigenous active protection system, and a hydro-pneumatic suspension that lets the tank physically tilt forward, backward, and sideways to alter its profile and gun elevation. Not yet combat tested, but selected by Poland as the centerpiece of one of the largest export tank deals of the modern era. In 3rd place, the French Leclerc XLR. The Leclerc has always been the tank that experts admired but the public overlooked. It entered service in 1993 as the first production main battle tank with an autoloader and a fully digital fire control system. The XLR upgrade, part of France's Scorpion program, brings it firmly into the 2020s, a battle management system that integrates the Leclerc into France's Joint Tactical Network, new composite side armor, improved mine protection, an upgraded fire control system, and provisions for active protection. It uses a unique hybrid power plant combining a diesel engine with a gas turbine supercharger, giving it some of the best mobility numbers in the world. Its only real weaknesses are scale. France only operates 200, and its non-NATO standard ammunition. In 2nd place, the American M1A2SEP, version 4 Abrams. The Abrams is the most combat-proven Western tank in history. Since its devastating debut in the 1991 Gulf War, where Abrams crews destroyed hundreds of Iraqi T-72s in one of the most lopsided armored engagements ever recorded, no Abrams crew member has ever been killed by enemy tank fire. The latest version 4 package adds the Israeli Trophy Active Protection System, third-generation thermal sights, a color display for the commander, enhanced processing power for fire control, and improved electrical generation. The composite armor, which incorporates depleted uranium mesh layers in the frontal arc, remains world-leading. The drawbacks are weight, well over 70 tons, fuel consumption from the gas turbine engine, and the absence of an autoloader, which slows sustained rate of fire. In first place, the German Leopard 2A8. The Leopard 2 has been the benchmark Western main battle tank for 4 decades, and the A8 represents the culmination of that lineage. It integrates the Israeli Trophy Active Protection System, the Rheinmetall L55A 120mm gun firing the latest DM73 and DM83 armor-piercing rounds, and a digital fire control system updated with combat data from Ukraine. But its real edge is its ecosystem. The Leopard 2 is in service with 19 nations, making it the de facto NATO standard. Spare parts, ammunition, training, and interoperability are aligned across half the alliance. When the rest of NATO trains together, they overwhelmingly train with or alongside Leopards. The Abrams may have a stronger individual combat record, but in terms of alliance-wide standardization, the Leopard 2A8 has already won the argument. Ranked 4th on the global table, but worth its own deep look because no other tank on the list has changed European procurement more in the last 5 years than the South Korean K2 Black Panther. The K2 has now been formally recognized by Guinness World Records as the most expensive main battle tank in series production. A single hull, in its baseline Korean configuration, has been priced at around $8.5 million. Polish export variants and the Polish-built K2PL are priced even higher, depending on options. The price tag is not arbitrary. The K2 combines almost every modern feature found anywhere else in the global tank market into a single platform. It mounts a 120mm 55 caliber smoothbore, longer than the older NATO standard, giving higher muzzle velocity and longer effective range. It uses an automatic loader, eliminating the human loader and increasing rate of fire. The fire control system is a hunter-killer architecture, allowing the commander and gunner to engage multiple threats per minute, even on the move. The K2's most distinctive feature, though, is its hydropneumatic suspension. The hull can be raised for cross-country performance, lowered for higher road speeds, leant forward to depress the main gun behind cover, leant backward to raise the gun for engaging high or low-flying threats, and leant sideways to maintain stability on slopes. Few tanks in the world can change their physical posture this way. On a defensive line in Korean or Central European terrain, that capacity to squat behind a ridge and tilt the hull upward to fire over it is enormously valuable. The protection package matches the firepower. Composite armor modules use materials and layups that remain classified, but the tank also carries an indigenous Korean active protection system combining soft-kill jammers and hard-kill interceptors. Crew survivability is among the best in the world. It also has one feature almost no other modern tank can match. The K2 can ford water up to 4.1 meters deep, over 13 feet, by deploying an extendable conning tower and intake snorkel. To keep tracks in contact with the ground while submerged, the hull can take on up to 500 gallons of water as ballast, increasing the tank's effective weight by around 2 tons during the crossing. Once the tank is back on dry land, the water is pumped out. It is a feature designed for the rivers and rice paddies of the Korean peninsula, but it has obvious utility elsewhere. The K2 can fire a smart top-attack munition known as the K-STAM, currently in its 2nd generation. The K-STAM is fired indirectly, like a small artillery shell, on an arcing trajectory of up to 8 kilometers, close to 5 miles. Once the round is in the vicinity of its target, it deploys a parachute, scans the area, and then fires an explosively formed penetrator downward into the lightly armored top of an enemy tank. It is one of the few main gun rounds in the world that can attack hostile armor beyond direct line of sight. The export story is just as remarkable as the tank itself. Turkey took inspiration from the K2's chassis and suspension when developing the Altay, and in 2022, Poland signed one of the largest single tank deals in modern history, agreeing in principle to acquire up to 1,000 K2s and K2PL variants, with hundreds to be assembled at Polish facilities. By 2026, the K2 is on its way to becoming the most successful new main battle tank export program of the decade. No serious treatment of the European tank race can ignore what is happening on the other side of the line. Russia's tank force, even after enormous losses, remains a serious threat in numerical terms. Active service today numbers around 3,460 hulls, a heavy mix of upgraded T-72s and T-80s, around 620 modern T-90Ms, and a long tail of older platforms. Behind that active fleet sits another 2,000-plus older tanks in storage. The much-vaunted T-14 Armata, by contrast, remains in a strange limbo. Total production is believed to be fewer than 24 hulls. Whether the Armata becomes a real fleet weapon or remains a partial showpiece is one of the open questions of the next decade. What is not in doubt is that Russia, even after enormous combat losses, intends to remain a tank power. Its industrial capacity, while strained, is still substantial. And it has demonstrated its willingness to absorb losses on a scale that Western planners do not, in the modern era, have any comparable example of. That single fact is one of the main reasons NATO armies have shifted from boutique forces back toward mass. One of the most important trends in the new European armored order is convergence. After 30 years in which every nation maintained its own variant, its own ammunition, and its own logistics chain, the future is starting to look very different. 3 platforms now define modern Western armor: the Leopard 2 family, increasingly built around the new A8 standard, the M1A2 SEP version 3 and version 4 Abrams, and the South Korean K2 Black Panther. Germany is leading Leopard 2 A8 adoption. Norway has selected it for its next generation purchase. The Czech Republic is moving from Soviet-era hulls straight to the A8 standard. Sweden, Spain, and potentially Finland and the Netherlands are all expected to follow with upgrades or purchases. The Abrams remains the heavy backbone of American forces in Europe, with Poland and Romania as its largest European operators. And the K2 has become the disruptor, bringing serious new mass into the alliance through Polish acquisition. This kind of convergence matters militarily because NATO armor becomes easier to sustain, upgrade, and deploy together. A continent built around common or closely aligned high-end platforms is very different from one relying on a patchwork of aging national fleets. Spare parts, ammunition stocks, training, and joint exercises all become more efficient. In the event of a long, high-intensity war, a converged fleet can be sustained where a fragmented one would not be. A tank is not just a weapon. It is the visible tip of a long industrial supply chain, and that supply chain is itself a strategic battlefield. For 30 years, European tank production was kept alive by a thin trickle of export orders and modest national upgrade programs. After 2022, that trickle became a flood, and the industrial base struggled to keep up. Lead times on new Leopard 2s stretched to 3 years and beyond. Governments responded. Germany expanded its production capacity. France revived dormant lines. South Korea, with the aggressive support of its government, expanded into Polish factories. The United States increased Abrams production rates. By the start of 2026, Europe had more tank building capacity than at any point since the early 1990s. The deeper question is whether that capacity is large enough. Real wars consume armor at a stunning rate. A war on the eastern flank lasting more than a year would chew through tanks faster than any single supplier could replace them. The strategic objective is no longer just to buy tanks. It is to build the capacity to keep building tanks under wartime conditions. So what does all of this add up to? The first conclusion is straightforward. The tank is back. After 30 years of polite skepticism and sometimes outright dismissal, the heavy main battle tank is once again the centerpiece of European land power. Every serious European army either has or is acquiring a fleet of modern hulls. Every doctrine that abandoned heavy armor for lighter expeditionary forces is being rewritten. The second conclusion is about Europe itself. For the first time in a generation, the eastern members of NATO are not the poor relations of the alliance, asking for help. They are the leading edge. Poland, in particular, has built itself in 5 years into the first or second most powerful land army in Europe by virtually any measure that matters. Romania, the Baltic states, Finland and Sweden have all moved into the top tier of European seriousness. The center of gravity of European land power has shifted east, and it is unlikely to shift back. The third conclusion is about technology. The defining capability of 2026 is not the size of the gun or the thickness of the armor, it is the active protection system. The trophy system, originally Israeli, is now standard on the Leopard 2A8, the M1A2 SEP version 4, and the Merkava 5. The K2 carries its own indigenous Korean version. The Challenger 3 is fitted with one. The Leclerc XLR is being readied for one. After the bloody lessons of Ukraine, no new main battle tank entering service in the Western world will be considered serious without an integrated hard-kill defensive system. That single change separates the tanks of 2026 from every previous generation. The fourth and most important conclusion is about scale. Russia still fields more steel than any individual European country. China fields more than that again. The question for NATO has never been whether it can build tanks of equal or better quality. It can. The question is whether it can build them in sufficient numbers with sufficient speed to absorb the kind of losses a long, high-intensity war would generate. The next decade of the European tank race will decide whether the answer is yes. What is already certain is that the era of free defense is over. The peace dividend that funded other priorities for 30 years has been spent. Whatever shape the continent takes next, it will be a continent that, once again, takes the heavy weapons of land warfare seriously. The tank, for better or worse, has returned to the center of European history. That is the big picture of how Europe rebuilt its armored fist and why the tank is back at the center of the continent's defense. But every single one of the machines we have just walked past, the Leopard, the Abrams, the Challenger, the Leclerc, the K2 Black Panther, has its own story, its own engineering battles, its own combat trials, its own near cancellations and quiet triumphs. There are videos to be made on each of them. You have just watched another chapter from the archives of war room history. We break down the battles, the strategies, and the political decisions that shape the modern world. No lectures, no textbooks, just the stories history doesn't slow down to explain. If you want more, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. New videos every week. We'll see you in the war room.